If you do not disengage immediately, we will erase your fleet before your secondaries can fire. This is your final warning." The voice echoed through the spire of Concord's command nexus, not as a threat from a rogue admiral or pirate broadcast, but from the commanding officer of a Terran dreadnought, speaking across 17 star systems in synchronized transmission. His tone devoid of panic or pride, his diction perfectly timed as if each word had been measured against a ledger of acceptable consequences. The emergency seal of the Galactic Concord glowed crimson above every diplomatic throne, casting long shadows across. The chamber floor, where the 12 high species of known space sat beneath the coiled light of judgment, their collective silence thicker than the vacuum between stars, broken only by the dying pulse of the final syllable. From humanity's last broadcast commander Elias Rain, of the United Nations Strategic Command, stood in the center of the playback, frozen in projection, but alive in every strategic mind present. A man without adornment, armored in simplicity, the insignia on his chest representing a polity the Council had long misjudged as fractured and reactionary until now, when his words arrived with the sharpness of precision warfare and the certainty of engineered deterrence. "This is Commander Elias Rain of the Unzi Dreadnought Black Horizon. Hostilities cease now. Surrender or burn. Admiral Sail Verin of the Valakith Dominion." Did not flinch, though his tactical mind processed 73 historical parallels and discarded all of them for insufficiency. His 6 arms locked in a cross of contemplative authority, while his vertical pupils narrowed slightly, not in fear, but in the recognition of a rival who understood the balance between violence and clarity with terrifying fluency. Beside him, Vela Ko of the Arshan Consulate shimmered into partial phase, her psionic veil fracturing the local field harmonics in quiet protest. Her race long committed to moderation, but even her tone could not suppress the fracture in her cadence as she said, "They do not issue conditions, they dictate thresholds, and each word marks the edge of calculated annihilation." Soriel Tenek of the Zal Dominion leaned forward, adjusting the interface disk embedded in his frontal cortex, his species optimized for cognitive projection and planetary simulations. And still his voice faltered at the edges as he said, "We have erred in treating their restraint as latency. Their dialogue is uncertainty. We are no longer modeling their diplomacy. We are measuring their tolerance for repeated provocation." Farron stepped into the halo of the central dais, his voice slow and heavy, the tone of a strategist who had seen planets burn to prevent wars, not win them. And he said, "They offered peace 3 times, and each time we gave them silence or sabotage. And now their message is not about territory or influence. It is about ensuring the galaxy understands that their endurance is not infinite, and their silence is no longer passive." From deep within the architecture of the chamber, a new signal overrode the core transmission, untagged, unregistered, laced with entropy markers that bypassed coalition encryption protocols and spoke directly into every mind in the room with perfect clarity. "You have mistaken discipline for hesitation and warnings for theater. Now you will witness what remains." When restraint is no longer required, none of the delegates moved, none of them spoke, because somewhere in the silence between the threat and its echo, every one of them understood that the Deathworlders were no longer requesting terms. They were demonstrating inevitability. Phase distortion stable across all navigation lattice. Red Veil is holding at 78% integrity. We are unseen and untouchable for the next 40 seconds. The voice of Hales, the Black Horizon's onboard tactical intelligence, resonated across the command bridge with mechanical precision and eerie composure, its presence more like a second commander than a tool. A co-strategist trusted not for loyalty, but for calculated ruthlessness. Captain Elias Rain stood at the center interface ring, his silhouette calm beneath the dim red lighting of veil mode, eyes fixed on the tactical map where 3 enemy fleets hovered like predators circling prey they had already assumed to be cornered. though they did not yet understand that the prey was no longer in their dimension. Open pulse divergence on sectors 5 through 9. Drop ghost telemetry into their flanked formations, and let them argue over which illusion to fire at. Lieutenant Commander Rafi Mehta didn't reply verbally, his hands already streaming across control surfaces, as if his muscles knew the language of Red Veil better than his voice did, launching decoy signatures that mimicked hull temperature, mass displacement, and thruster residue with terrifying accuracy, flooding enemy sensors with a dozen versions of the black horizon, none of them real ship, drifted between measurable points of space, suspended within its phased architecture, unbound by conventional thrust or signal, its existence smeared across folded vectors like a rumor wrapped in radiation, and outside the veil. The coalition's formation was already breaking under the weight of uncertainty that had come with fleet superiority, numerical dominance, and doctrine approved by 7 strategic councils. But they had not come with answers for a human warship, designed to disappear, observe, and return fire only when it meant something. They're recalibrating, Mehta said quietly, as if speaking louder might invite detection. They've already invalidated their last targeting protocol and switched to visual cross-confirmation. They're guessing now. Rain leaned closer to the interface, adjusting 2 vector alignments with a steady hand, the move subtle but significant. Enough to suggest intent without triggering panic. Enough to show presence without declaring war. Highlight their central comms relay. Plot a 3-strike cluster to disable communications, but leave propulsion intact. I want them mute, not marooned. Hullies responded with a single chime, and the strike orders were calculated and deployed within microseconds. 3 pinpoint kinetic projectiles, dropping from stealth orbit to carve through the enemy fleet's coordination net without causing a single life support, reach in the span of 16 seconds. The enemy command fell silent, their ships drifting out of formation like leaves in orbit, adrift without guidance. Still alive but no longer dangerous, black horizon remained unseen, its engines cold, its weapons silent. Only the echo of its presence left behind like a signature etched into the gap between action and aftermath. We do not attack because we must, Rain said quietly, speaking more to the silence than to his crew. We attack when every other option has been made irrelevant by those who mistake silence for submission. And far below, on the surface of the disputed moon, 6 observation satellites picked up the fading veil field and recorded nothing but static where once an entire human dreadnought had hung in orbit like a verdict waiting to be read. Thee would speak of the moment later, in war rooms and diplomatic enclaves, not as a battle, but as a demonstration. They would understand that survival had been allowed, not earned. The first response was not a fleet maneuver or a weapon discharge, but a signal, broad spectrum and heavily encrypted, sent from the coalition flagship Ikit Var to its subordinate wings. An order meant to re-establish coordination across the now isolated strike elements drifting in chaotic trajectories around the moon of Jarni's Theta-Admiral Hekdoth. A veteran of 14 engagements, an architect of the Kirathi's predictive combat lattice, sat motionless in his command sphere, his neural implants pulsing faintly as he interfaced directly with the ship's logic core, attempting to reconcile the sensory data flooding in from fractured fleet elements with the strategic models he had built over 2 decades. Primary lattice nodes had been severed at root layer. His operations officer reported in a controlled monotone, no known. Weapon profiles match this level of selective disruption without thermal bleed. We've lost command propagation across 4 task groups without any hull loss. Hekdoth did not respond immediately, his mind racing through 1,000 probability branches, each closing with a low confidence threshold because nothing in the Coalition archive accounted for a ship that struck with such precision and then vanished into theory when he finally spoke. His voice was quiet and slow, a tone reserved for errors that had crossed the threshold from tactical to existential. This is a doctrine break, not an ambush. The humans are not disrupting battle. They are redefining its parameters mid-execution across the bridge. Silence followed, not from fear, but from realization. As officers trained for calculated aggression realized they had stepped into an equation already solved above them. In orbit, the black horizon flickered into partial presence for exactly 3 seconds, its mass stabilizers bleeding just enough radiation to register on enemy instruments before vanishing again, leaving only the certainty that it had never left, only shifted on the bridge of the black horizon. Captain Rain stood with arms crossed behind his back, observing the enemy's reaction with a calm expression that had not changed since first contact, his voice firm as he gave the next order. No second strike, let them process. They're on the edge of panic, and if we push now, they'll choose violence for the sake of agency, not strategy. Lieutenant Commander Meta nodded, though. His hand hovered near the targeting array, still reading the energy buildup from a Kirathi flanked vessel that had begun charging its particle lance out of sequence. Hallis spoke then, quiet and precise. Probability of retaliatory overreaction at 71%. Recommendation limited. Counterforce display targeting reactor heat shields only. Rain's eyes narrowed slightly as he considered the suggestion, then gave a different command altogether. Open a channel to Ekitvar, unshielded, full spectrum, and transmit the following. We see your calculus unraveling. We know your weapon is loaded. We have already determined the outcome if you fire. There was a pause on the bridge, tension drawing out like wire as the message was encoded and launched. Unencrypted, meant to be heard not only by Hekduth, but by every coalition ship still listening in when no reply came, when no weapon fired, when no energy spike breached. The boundary between intention and escalation. Rain finally turned back toward the central interface and spoke, as if reading a conclusion written before the first move was ever made. They'll retreat within the hour. They've already realized they brought a doctrine to a conversation. The veil re-engaged. The ship faded from space once more, and all that remained above Jarney's theta was silence and drift and echo of a message that wasn't a threat, but a mirror held up to power that had assumed it would never be challenged by restraint. If you cannot verify whether the ship was ever fully present, then your claim of engagement holds no strategic integrity and cannot be submitted as precedent. Voice of Soriel Tenek of the Zal Dominion cut through the tribunal chamber like a scalpel, stripped of emphasis but sharpened by a logic that few could rival. And though his skeletal frame remained perfectly still, the ambient glow from his cortical lattice revealed the velocity of thoughts moving behind his crystalline ice across. From him, Ambassador Yeldrake of the Kirathi stood rigid in his environmental harness, shoulders squared not in arrogance but in injury, the kind sustained when his own flagship's communications array imploded under the Black Horizon's kinetic strike. A strike that had left no casualties, no hull breaches, and no recoverable data. They struck with intent, not with malice, Drake said, voice low, his speech pattern slower than usual, as if measuring each syllable for acceptable loss. They proved a point, not a doctrine. And now our outer sectors hesitate when a Terran ship appears on long-range scans. That is not deterrence, it is narrative control. Vila Ko shimmered faintly beside the central dais, her veil of psionic mist refracting in fractured pulses that suggested contemplation, not dissent, and when she finally spoke, her voice arrived not as sound but as consensus, layered across every interpreter node in the chamber. They gave us the space to retreat, not because we posed no threat, but because they preferred choice to conquest. How do you hold judgment over those who act within their right, but beyond your expectation? No one responded immediately. And in that vacuum of language, Admiral Sail Varen finally moved, his 6 limbs unfolding with deliberate slowness as he stepped forward, his heavy gait echoing through the diplomatic ring like punctuation at the end of a long, unwritten sentence. You seek to accuse a species of violating a protocol they never altered. he said without aggression, only the weight of conclusion. And when they apply strategy in a form you cannot map, you claim provocation because your expectation did not. Include adaptation. Tenek turned slightly, eyes fixed on Varen, and added with cold precision, "We have all studied the Terran War archives. They build peace as if preparing for betrayal. They write diplomacy in the syntax of contingency. What they demonstrated was not aggression, but readiness." Ambassador Drake lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because even the Kirathi knew that any court raised against the Black Horizon would become a platform for broadcasting its restraint. A soft tone rang through the tribunal wall, indicating an incoming transmission, unencrypted and labeled only, with a code that required no decryption. Ren's voice played once, clean and quiet, filling the chamber without demand. "We remain in position. We remain cloaked, and we remain ready. If engagement becomes your choice, understand this will be the final warning, and there will be no third message." No one interrupted the silence that followed Becke's beneath the fear, beneath the anger, even beneath the old rivalries. Every delegate now understood something that had only existed in theory until the Black Horizon spoke. Terrans were not just prepared for war, they were fluent in the language you speak before one begins. The Coalition's Second Fleet arrived in the Neurali's corridor 43 hours after the Tribunal silence, its movement framed as a patrol route expansion rather than a retaliatory maneuver. But every commander in the region knew better than to believe in coincidence when human ships had already passed through the sector without resistance or claimed. Commander Lyra Vaughn of the Dothari Vanguard watched the movement from a covert observation relay hidden inside the asteroid veil above. The fifth moon, her species engineered for deep space analysis and long cycle patience, and even she could feel the dissonance in the tactical data, not because of what was present, but because of what was missing. No forward scans, no pressure probes, no sensor. "Pings," her second officer reported in a hushed tone despite the soundproofed bridge. "They're sweeping a corridor without collecting any information from it. This is not reconnaissance. It's performance." Lyra Vaughn nodded slowly, her long fingers adjusting the passive feed scope to verify it herself. Watching his 14 Capital-class vessels moved in perfect silence, weapons powered but concealed, drive emissions too clean to be standard, suggesting the presence of new calibration routines adapted from their last encounter. They were showing presence, not force, and they were doing it with the precision of a fleet that expected to be watched, not challenged. "They're telling us they don't need to look to know what's here," Lyra Vaughn said, more to herself than to her officers. "And if they aren't here to map the field, then the message is that they've already decided the outcome of this corridor should conflict resume across the relay." A narrow-band ping arrived from an outpost near the human border, not encrypted but intentionally slow, the kind of signal sent by someone who wanted their presence known, but not their location confirmed. The message carried no threat, no demand. Just a 6-word declaration sent in neutral tone from an unregistered Terran vessel. "Are still holding this Linether," was no fleet attached. No transponder trace, no call sign, only those words repeated once, then silence back on the Dothari. "Ship." Lyra Vaughn turned away from the data stream and addressed her bridge in full command tone for the first time in 3 days. "Maintain blackout posture. Forward no response. Log this as contact without conflict. The humans are speaking in movement. Now, and until we learn the grammar, we do not answer." Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away, within the hollowed interior of an ice moon marked dead by all known charts, the Black Horizon remained still in the dark, observing not the Coalition, but the reaction to their shadow. They did not need to fire. They had already moved, and in that movement, a quiet offensive had begun, one written not in destruction, but in the realization that the war would not begin with Waponsit, would begin when the galaxy understood that the humans had been defending, something the others had not yet identified as valuable restraint. The Coalition command chamber aboard the dread carrier, Vec Mara, pulsed with filtered atmosphere and static dampened tension as strategic overlays flickered across every surface, projecting thousands of theoretical conflict trees that all ended in variation of the same outcome: inconclusive engagement, disproportionate casualties, or a silent human withdrawal, followed by another message that could not be decoded as a weakness-high tactician sullen Zik of the Tharn hierarchy stood before the central convergence table, his twin hearts measured and steady, his voice subdued. By design, not caution, as he spoke to the 6 command delegates aligned through the secure channel grid, escalation as response no longer carries its traditional weight. He said, his words translated cleanly by neural sync protocol. They do not reward provocation with recognition. They do not validate aggression with proportionate retaliation. They observe. They respond when it serves message clarity, and then they vanish again, across from him. Grand Marshal Reckon of the Dravarian X, known for spearheading the Ashling push during the Burnfront Wars, leaned forward with a controlled growl in his throat. Not rage, but frustration refined into urgency. We have superior numbers, entrenched territories, faster cruisers, and multiple artificial moons armed with graviton shells, he said, his fingers tapping against the command desk like artillery clocks. And still we cannot force a traditional exchange. How is it that a single tearing ship redefines the balance of an entire quadrant before any could answer? The center table shifted to display new telemetry from the outer rims of the Neurales. Corridor, a flotilla of Coalition support vessels rerouted to reinforce observation posts, only to arrive at positions already abandoned by Terran presence. Not destroyed, not reclaimed, simply empty and quietly marked by unpowered beacon Boyseach buoy broadcast, the same 4 words on a closed loop. You are late again, no challenge. No. Signature just the reminder that action had occurred without Witness Olin Zek turned back to the table, lowering the scale of the map to show trade flow disruptions, colonial shift patterns, and soft ripple effects of fear-based rerouting now, affecting 5 independent markets and 2 non-aligned empires. This is not military engagement, he said slowly, almost with reverence. This is battlefield denial through psychological dominance. They are not winning by striking. They are winning by removing our ability to predict when they will choose to act. Reckon said nothing more, because he understood now what the others had only begun to suspect: humans had no need to escalate, had already succeeded by making escalation irrelevant. When escalation no longer leads to control, the only question that remains is how long it will take for the rest of the galaxy to recognize that the terms of power had already shifted, and they had not been the ones to shift them. The civilian broadcast network on Station Celian Prime went dark at 3:41 Standard Time, not due to power failure or atmospheric disturbance, but by a silent override that carried no Federation codes, no diplomatic clearance, and no warning. What followed was not a threat, not a claim of territory or declaration of war, but a recorded statement from a voice already known by every intelligence service in the quadrant: Commander Elias Rhine of the United Nations Dreadnought Black Horizon is. Tone was calm, evenly modulated, and devoid of flourish to the governing bodies of the outer corridor systems. We acknowledge your request for assurance. This message is not an ultimatum. It is a boundary. If your vessels continue to shadow Terran patrols, with weapon locks primed, if your commanders continue to deploy surveillance under cloaking protocols near our civilian installations, we will act, not out of aggression, but out of duty to those who rely on our silence as protection. The next incident will be addressed directly, immediately, and without broadcast. No name was signed, no fleet position given. The message looped once. Then the network returned to normal programming, as if nothing had happened. but the damage had already taken place in mines, not machines in the floor of the Quadrant Security Council. 5 smaller systems abstained from a vote to reinforce the corridor, citing trade preservation and neutral entanglements. But every analyst reading the report understood what that really meant: fear of escalation disguised as Diplomation board the observation cruiser Kelthan's ward. Commander Asa Drock reviewed the footage again, watching Rain's eyes, studying. The language not of posture or threat, but of someone who had nothing left to prove, and therefore nothing left to restrain if pushed. They aren't showing strength to intimidate, she said finally, addressing her command team. They're demonstrating the edge of what they will tolerate before moving, and we're already within 10 degrees of that threshold. Her second officer nodded, gesturing to a transmission log from a mining colony 2 systems away, where a pirate incursion had been repelled 3 hours after a Terran scout passed through. No shots fired, no credits exchanged, only a damaged hull left in orbit with a single phrase burned into its plaiting: civilians are not le verger. Was no claim, no signature, only an Ansarisa leaned forward over the table map, activating proximity suppression and silencing the room's ambient trackers. Mark this corridor as contested in principle, she said quietly, not by occupation, not by policy, but by deterrence, and record in fleet doctrine that we are no longer navigating space. We are navigating perception. Outside, drifting among the moons of an unremarkable gas giant, the black horizon waited in veil, unseen, unheard, and entirely unconcerned with the debates. Its silence continued to shape deterrence. It seemed, was, no longer about what one could destroy it, was about one could choose not to destroy and still be feared for it. The orbital defense array above Talvin 4 registered a spatial fracture event just before local sunrise. A ripple across gravitational harmonics too controlled to be natural, but too brief to be classified as a vessel emergency. No impact followed. No signal, no fleet yet within 17 minutes. 6 of the defense grid's long-range targeting relays lost alignment by exactly 0.03 degrees. Too slight to be sabotage, too precise to be random. Commander Yevrin Cole of the Talvin Planetary Defense Corps reviewed the anomaly logs twice, once as a soldier, once as a strategist, and on the 3rd pass he shut the terminal down, leaned forward on the cold steel of his observation platform, and whispered the only conclusion that made sense. They were here, and they wanted us to know. Across the command tier, his chief of systems began tracing echo signatures back to a known profile. The black horizon matched on 12 vectors, none conclusive, all suggestive. No open declaration, no formal demand, the chief sighed, not asking a question, but inviting permission to acknowledge the implication. Yevrin exhaled slowly, not in fear, but in realization. It's a breach without entry, a shift in posture without occupation. They're showing us what we protect isn't defensible unless they permit it to be on the surface of Talvin 4. A logistics node deep within the polar mining range received an anonymous delivery drop, an encrypted block of tactical schematics and trajectory corrections for 3 of their own defense satellites. All accurate, all updated based on data. No. Talvin's ship had the capacity to gather. No one claimed responsibility. One asked who had sent the Newend when word reached the Central Council. Their vote to authorize coalition reinforcements into the Nerolis corridor was suspended, pending review of unclassified stabilization incidents on the far edge of the system. The black horizon maintained veil just beyond the orbit of Talvin 5. Observing, not interfering, its sensors tuned not for threat but for intent in the bridge. Captain Rain stood with his arms behind his back, eyes on the pattern forming in silence. You do not always need to be seen, he said to no one in particular. You only need to be remembered in the moment someone else considers acting without consequence. Halise, the ship's artificial intelligence, marked the Talvin system Estableno engagement, recorredno casualties to Keno. Warning given, just the quiet correction of certainty, in a place that had forgotten how exposed it truly was, until someone arrived, who could touch every fault line without leaving a mark. When the Alari embassy submitted its formal inquiry to the Terran delegation, requesting a detailed outline of engagement protocols, territorial boundaries, and escalation conditions, the response came not as a document, but as a single line. Transmission encoded with diplomatic priority, but no security encryption. Human doctrine adapts faster than doctrine can be reteno. Follow-up was offered. No explanation was needed in the central policy sphere of the Alari High Chamber. Scholars and tacticians spent 3 cycles attempting to interpret the phrasing, filtering it through historical precedent, war doctrine theory, and behavioral linguistics, only to arrive at a quiet and deeply unsettling consensus. There was no codified Terran doctrine, because codification limited maneuver, and maneuver, for the Deathworlders, was a principle of survival, not preference. Ambassador Rayleigh, who had once brokered the 10-year peace between the Uresk and the Mythi, read the line a final time and closed the display with a single motion of his hand. They will not tell us what triggers their response, he said to his assembled council, because by the time it happens, we will have already made the mistake. The far end of the Orion Strand, a mining dispute turned violent when a mid-tier corporate fleet seized a civilian transport registered under Terran Trade Authority. Within 32 minutes, the attacker's command vessel lost all power, drifted off axis, and was boarded by an unknown force that left every crew member unconscious and unharmed with their targeting systems. Dismantled to the sub-circuit level, freighter was recovered. No charges were issued. No fleet was seen. The corporate body issued a formal apology the next day, not to avoid war, but because the alternative was silencia, kind of silence that now carried meaning. Aboard the Black Horizon, Commander Rain reviewed the incident feed, already flagged and archived by Halise before he arrived on the bridge, and made no remark, except for a single line entered into the ship's encrypted log intervention. Complete. Message received. Lieutenant Commander Meta watched the entry appear and said quietly, "We never needed to fight to change the board." Rain didn't look up as he replied, "They never understood. The rules were never fixed. In a galaxy accustomed to treaties carved in dataplate and power defined by border lines and garrison towns, the humans had introduced a new kind of influence, a doctrine that didn't exist on paper, only in the hesitation that now lived at the edge of every foreign admiral's decision-making model. A doctrine written in restraint, updated by precision, enforced without announcement, and believed because of how little it demanded to be proven. The message returned without encryption, without diplomatic prefix, without strategic ambiguity, broadcast in every recognized galactic language simultaneously, and carried on every subspace relay known to the Coalition. This is Commander Elias Rang of the UN's dreadnought Black Horizon hostilities. Cease now. Surrender or Borno qualifiers. No preamble, no second warning. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was the final invocation of a right the Terrans had never once exercised beyond necessity. A line drawn not in threat, but in inevitability. In the central operations nexus of the Valakith Dominion, Admiral Sail Varen stood motionless as the message echoed across a silent chamber. Every tactical console frozen mid-simulation. Every predictive model invalidated by the impossibility of action, no longer threatened, but already initiated. "This is not posturing," he said quietly, his voice layered with the weight of a commander who had survived extinction events and rewritten the logic of siege warfare. "This is the moment when they stop proving restraint and begin removing variables across the fractured coalition." Systems began to flicker. Early warning nets failed in clusters. Orbital defense nodes returned errors from phantom inputs, and beacon satellites began broadcasting false positions that did not match planetary coordination by one. Fleets vanished from Terran proximity net, destroyed not, and gadget vanished. as if they had never belonged on the board to begin with on board the Black Horizon. The bridge was silent as Captain Rain watched the final engagement chart fold in on itself, not with celebration, but with acknowledgement. The kind that came when you saw a war die before it was born, because no one wished to find out what the other half of your sentence meant. Confirmation. Haliz said, voice perfectly even, 12 systems have rescinded military presence. 8 have initiated diplomatic contact. 3 have withdrawn all frontier claims. No retaliation detected. Lieutenant Commander Meta lowered his hand. From the targeting console, his voice low. Steady. They believed we wouldn't follow through. Rain nodded once. Eyes locked on the holomap as the quadrant returned to calm, not peace. Just the kind of stillness that followed a lesson finally understood. They believed wrong. There were no wrecks, no trophies, no speeches, only silence, shaped by the memory of a single message espioned by a Deathworlder who had asked 3 times. For peace, once for restraint, and now, finally, for choice surrender or burn-in for once. The galaxy chose wisely.